want to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5 this morning. Matthew chapter 5. I'll be there in just a moment. A couple housekeeping things. Following along in the book, if you want to mark number 276, number 276 will be the song after the lesson this morning. And that will be projected as well at the end of the lesson. Our preaching theme for the year, as we introduced the first Sunday of 2022, is the Sermon on the Mount. We are spending this whole year, once a month, looking at the teachings of Jesus, the manifesto of the kingdom, if you will, the Christian's constitution, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. As I learned very quickly, that is a tall order. We could have spent months in the Beatitudes alone, and we quickly had to go through them. And this morning, we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, which traditionally has been called the similitudes. For after Christ opens the sermon with this portrait of what a disciple of him is like, or what a citizen of the kingdom is, his character, all those Beatitudes there, he then goes on to describe a disciple's influence. A disciple's influence. If you were to think of or try and describe what is a Christian like, we might come up with various different things. One I've thought of is perhaps a compass, for we point the way to God. That'd be a good one. But Christ uses two comparisons that we readily get the light one in verses 14 through 16. But sometimes I think we miss, or we don't appreciate as much, the comparison to salt. And so this morning we want to look at those two comparisons and draw some lessons from them. Our reading this morning is fairly short, so Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 13. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. As I was trying to write this on the plane, and where I found time over the last week, I found that really I could have spent the whole sermon on just verse 13 about our comparison to salt. And likewise, we could have spent several weeks on light as well, but I'm not here to hold you hostage. Starting off with salt. There are two things that we need to get clear from this text in order for us to really understand how Jesus is using this simile, this comparison, to really understand how is a Christian supposed to be like salt. Why is this a fitting and apt illustration for our character and influence? And that goes to, we understand the fundamental characteristics of salt. Why would Jesus use this? And how on earth can salt lose its saltiness? Now, I know there are some of you here who are much learned and much smarter than I in the hard sciences, and you'll tell me that salt actually does not lose its saltiness. Well, chemically true, but we'll get to that in just a moment. While there's many different aspects of salt we could talk about, one is, for example, it has antiseptic qualities. There's a reason why you get a canker sore or something, you're supposed to gargle salt water. It actually alleviates the irritation there and helps get rid of some of the bad bacteria. There are two characteristics of salt that have been known probably since the garden, and that is salt gives flavor and it prevents decay. It gives flavor and prevents decay. So how are Christians supposed to be flavorful? Salt has a very distinct flavor. In fact, when salt is present in a dish, as it ought to be, one sometimes hardly notices it's there. But if it's missing, boy, do you notice it. Food becomes bland. I mean, many of us who have gone through McDonald's probably late in the afternoon and gotten the bad batch of French fries, where there's no salt on them whatsoever. My opinion is they don't salt the fries like they used to, and they're all bad anymore, and so you just need to ask for salt anyway. But I digress. Salt is distinct. And as a citizen of the kingdom, we are supposed to be distinct. We are supposed to stand out in a crowd. That's a good thing. We want to stand out in the right ways. We don't want to stand out because we're being obnoxious or ugly or trying to think that righteousness or soundness is dependent upon how rude or obnoxious we can be or how many fights we can get into. Really, salt or saltiness comes from possessing the character traits enumerated in Matthew 5, 3 through 10, or 3 through 12, really. Those Beatitudes: being poor in spirit, the mournful, the meek, hungering and thirsting for righteousness, merciful, being pure in heart, being peacemakers, and being persecuted for the sake of the cause of Christ. That will make us stand out. In fact, so much so in Mark's account of the gospel, Mark chapter 9 and verse 50. Jesus said on another occasion that salt is good, but if salt loses its flavor, how will you season it? Have salt in yourselves and have peace with one another. The key here is, again, in yourselves. It's not any action. It has everything to do with character. In Luke's account of the Sermon on the Plain, or Sermon on the Mount, in Luke chapter 6 and verse 45, if you want to turn over there, Luke chapter 6 and verse 45, we read Jesus' statement here. Let's start in verse 43 for the full context of what Jesus is teaching here. So Luke chapter 6, starting verse 43 through 45. For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree is known by its own fruit, for men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from bramble bushes. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks. Saltiness, then, is actually dependent upon what is internal. And saltiness for the disciple will be visibly seen by what we say and how we act, but mainly how we conduct ourselves. What does the heart overflow with? I will tell you, one who possesses the character traits of the kingdom and the Beatitudes, that will become very, very apparent. Very apparent. This last week, Florida College gave their Friend of Youth Award. And I forgot the man's name, but it was to one man who works on the campus who has worked there for decades. He's a single man, never married, owns a home near the campus. And every year, the seniors have this ceremony where they give a coin to honor a faculty member or a staff member. And every year, he gets one. But this man embodies, I would say, the attributes of the kingdom and being a Christian. This man, several times over, has given spare bedrooms to students when they were either homeless or could not get home from break. One student said in his gratitude speech one year to this man, "He has literally given me the shirt off his back." He has given up his home for periods of time so that others would not go without. He always has a word of encouragement, a meek persona, a scripture to give to a student or a faculty member who's going through a hard time. He is a man who, just by that description, I don't know him personally. Immediately I saw those character traits present in the Beatitudes. You can't hide it. You can't hide Christian saltiness. It's an outpouring of what it was within. And so Christians are distinct from the world in that regard. In fact, if you want to take one example of that, just think of how the world, what the default of the world is anymore. Complaining and murmuring and fault-finding. Not a good thing can be recognized by somebody without also mentioning 3 or 4 bad things. Take whatever president you want, this one, the last one, the one before that, or the one before that one. Take your news source, even if they have to admit something they did good, they will quickly follow that up with, well, you got to remember he also did all these bad things too. That's just how it is. Or the constant complaining or gossip in the workforce. Just a Christian trying to seek to, in all things, without grumbling or complaining, give thanks. To not engage in gossip. That's going to make you stick out real quick. That's going to have a preserving effect on society, which goes to that next point. Salt prevents corruption. Before refrigeration, before ice could be imported into countries or imported anywhere other than the Scandinavian or northern countries to preserve food, you salted your meat. And for example, ham or pork, if you salt pork, as the way it's supposed to be, so no one go out after services now and take what I said and try and do it. I don't want you getting botulism or anything. But if you salt pork, it can keep for 2 weeks unrefrigerated. That's long enough time for a family to perhaps go through a rack of ribs or something in the ancient world to actually keep food that long. On sea voyages, they would keep meat stored in barrels of salt in order to preserve it for the journey so they could have some sort of quick source of high protein nutrition. That's why many of the First Nation peoples of the American Southwest and Southeast made jerky. It wasn't because it was a good snack on hiking. It's because you could keep the meat for a long time. God has done many things to prevent the corruption and decay of this world. Two, for example, God has given the institution of government and the home to prevent moral decay. Paul in Romans 13, around the 4th verse, talks about how the government bears the sword for nothing. Doesn't bear the sword for nothing. And government should not be a fear to those who do good, but only a fear to those who do evil. Government, since the beginning, has, some of the first laws ever recorded are laws about murder. And almost universally, they carry the death penalty. But also the home is a force for good. In fact, right now, economists in the United States are actually very concerned at the decline of marriage and family in this country because marriage and family tend to be the number one indicator of economic growth and prosperity. Japan's already 50 years ahead of us in that their demographic pyramid is completely inverted. They have more elderly people than they do have young people. And there's nothing wrong with being elderly. But you get in that population, it's a population that historically can't work as they used to, have trouble providing for themselves, and there's a real concern that there's not enough people to support this top. There's a reason why God gave marriage in the home. But even those two institutions are not the primary way in which God sought to stay moral decay in a culture. God has always sought to have his own redeemed, regenerate people to be the primary source of preventing moral decay. As one writer said, God intends the most powerful of all restraints within sinful society to be his own redeemed, regenerate, and righteous people. And the main way, we talk at length, but the main way Christians can do that is by being who they ought to be. Standing firm on the truth of the gospel and not being ashamed of it. If something is wrong, call it out. In love, of course, as we'll talk about tonight in Ephesians 4, verse 15, speaking the truth in love. That's not just to each other, that's to all people. That's knowing how to articulate the truth in the way that is most receptive to the person. It's also by not compromising on our Christian convictions and character. Tertullian, in his apology in the 2nd century, wrote about the envy that the pagans had for Christians. He said that they couldn't go by without saying something good with also censoring their own comment. He said they would say, look how they love each other, while secretly they would still hate us. Look how they're ready to die for each other, while they're secretly harboring murder and threats against us. But his whole point was, even the pagans who did not like Christians were forced to recognize their moral conduct and their character and what they stood for and what they would do for each other. A more recent example, or in recent history, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a man of faith in Nazi Germany. He actually studied in the United States in the 30s. And he had friends at the college who implored him, do not go back to Germany. You will be killed. He said, how is it right that I should stay here in the United States while brethren are in Germany being persecuted? So he went back and never left. He eventually was rounded up by the Gestapo and the SS, and eventually was hanged for Christian convictions. But it's interesting, in Eric Metaxas' biography of Bonhoeffer, he came across some notes and letters of the SS prison guards. they had serious issues executing him. But what Bonhoeffer did in prison, he would overhear talk between the guards. And when one would come to bring him his food, he would ask, "How's your mother doing? I heard she was sick. Is your wife doing better?" He didn't compromise on what the gospel taught about Christian character. And so, even in that dark, evil society, there was a force for moral that prevented some level of moral decay, that at least they understood there were others who were not going to bend the knee. And there were others who were different. The main way we prevent corruption in this world is by us being who we ought to be. And there's a big condition to that effect. You look at the end of the verse. Beginning of the verse, But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now, as I said before, I know some of you will say that, chemically speaking, salt cannot lose its saltiness. This is true. But it can become so diluted with impurities and imperfections that the effect is mute. Near where Jesus did much of his teaching is something called the Dead Sea. It's called that because there has not been water in that sea for centuries. Even in Jesus' day, it was just a dried lake. But in that lake, that dried lake bed, there is this faint, white, dusty powder. It's sodium chloride in the most pure form. But in those days, there was no refineries. There's no way to harvest that to remove the imperfections. And so when Jesus says, if salt loses its saltiness, he probably has in mind that kind of salt you found in the Dead Sea, because it was called that. It was good for nothing, but to simply left there and trampled underfoot. And this is the danger for all of us. We can talk all day about saltiness. What does it mean to be salty? How can we be salt to the world? How can we prevent corruption and so forth? I think most of us who have been Christians for any length of time probably know what that means or have an idea what we should be doing. Standing for the truth of the gospel, teaching the gospel to people, not compromising on the convictions of the gospel. But I think the real danger is the impurities, what we allow in. Because make no mistake, Jesus has there's an amazing blessing and a warning here in this passage. The blessing is if we take seriously the call of discipleship and saltiness, we will be the world's saviors. And I don't mean that in a messianic Christ-like sense, but we will be a preventive, a mitigating force for evil at preventing it. And we will show people the light of the gospel. But if we let ourselves become so diluted and allowed impurities and imperfections to come into our Christian walk, the danger is, and the warning is, that you will be good for nothing but to be trampled underfoot. And Jesus says if salt loses its saltiness, how can it regain that? The implied answer is it can't. You've lost your effect on people. May I suggest to you, and this by no means an exhaustive list, but the number one way Christians lose their distinctiveness, their effectiveness, their saltiness, it is that, what are they now, 52 inches? I think that's the most common size. That 52-inch black box we all have in our living rooms, or most of us have in our living rooms. I don't say that because I still have one. I just know some of you are smarter than I and have gotten rid of it. It's by what we watch, what we entertain ourselves with, what news programs we watch, all of it. I must say this with a smile, and you know I know you love me, and so you're going to allow me to say this. The people of God would be in a much better place today if we turned off Fox News, CNN, CSNBC, and all the like of it. Because I don't care what the political leanings is. Those news networks only get ratings for promoting things and engaging in tactics that are antithetical to the gospel. Paul explicitly condemns factions, divisions, and infighting among the people of God. What do the primetime news shows thrive on? Factions, divisions, and infighting among the people of this country. I'm not saying don't be uninformed. We are to be informed, but there's ways you can do that. But think about how much time we have collectively spent on worthless things. And I say this as one who was convicted, because I heard a lesson on this last week, and I sat there in my pews going, man, ouch. But if we start thinking, well, I think this is a sign that perhaps we've become a little bit deluded. Is when we start seeing the world as like, well, they're not that much different from what I do. There's really not a big difference between us. I would say perhaps it's an indication that we have allowed impurities to come in. Because as Paul says in Romans chapter 2 about the moral Gentiles, so the only reason they're doing things of the law is because they're doing it by accident. Okay, there's certain moral principles that everybody's kind of agreed on. Like, okay, yeah, we should probably not kill people. Murder's bad. We probably shouldn't steal or cheat on our taxes. But that's not because of any knowledge of God that they've come to that conclusion. That's just kind of like, well, yeah, dying's not fun, so we shouldn't probably allow people to kill people. James says in James chapter 4 and verse 4, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore makes him to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. If we compromise to any degree our character, our doctrine, or convictions, we have ruined our effectiveness as salt. I will tell you one illustration before I move on to light, and it will be to my own shame. As a young Christian, the tongue was not my friend. And I will say this, cursing was the thing. And so even now, mentally, those tracks in my mind, I have to guard against that kind of language. I will say it's under control. I'm fighting it, and I'm not trying to brag on any about this. But I remember very vividly working at a job. And, I was talking as I did at that time. And somebody added me on Facebook and saw some of the things I was doing on Sundays, again, to my shame. And they said, I never would have thought you were a Christian by the way you talk. Brenden, I tell you, I felt 2 feet small at that, and it was a huge gut check. The thing that hurts me the most was I had ruined my effectiveness before I even began. And so many of us have done that. We've ruined the chance we had with people before we even got to know them because we have not taken seriously the call to be a distinct, unique, separate people. But we're not called to simply be a unique people to live in this little commune. These similitudes show us that actually we're called to be unique and separate so that we may serve the world. Picking up in verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Lights are not hidden, in case any of us forgot that fact. Jesus reminds of that very plainly. You don't light a lamp to hide it, and a city on a hill you don't build a city on a hill just to hide it away someplace. They're meant to be seen. They're meant to be seen. Which is a point for us, a secret disciple is no more use in the world than one who has lost his saltiness. We think of Joseph of Arimathea. He was a secret disciple for most of Jesus' ministry. He was. And it's only when Christ dies that he finally has the courage to actually do something. He said, perhaps he reasoned, I didn't do anything for my Lord while he lived, but I'm going to do something now that he is dead. I'm going to make sure that body gets the right burial. Don't be a secret disciple. And the main point from this is discipleship is not to be hidden. Discipleship is not to be a private affair. Satan and the world love this kind of discipleship. In fact, in the current debates about religious liberty and freedom in this country, many have said, we have no problem with religious liberty so long as you keep shut and keep it in your closet. Well, that might work for other people, but that doesn't work for what Christ has commanded us to do. Take the Great Commission, for example, Matthew 28:19 through the end of the chapter. Go into all the world, preach the gospel to all creation. Well, that's not keeping it in a closet. That's not keeping it to yourself. My saltiness and light is completely irrelevant if I decide to simply follow Christ and the only public thing I do is I come to this building. It has to be lived. This light is not to be hidden. Light is also used to be seen. There's a reason why we have lamps in our bedrooms and our closets, and we have flashlights just in case power goes out. We need to see where we're going. We need to see the path. As Jesus said again in verse 16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. The idea is that we should live in such a way that when people see us, they don't think, oh, what a nice person. But they see us, and through us, they have seen Christ. And by seeing Christ, they give glory to God, even though they might be slandering us in so doing. This was much of the perplexity of the early Romans, governors who had to deal with Christians. They thought them to be a strange sect, devoid of anything that was good in religion. But even them, they had to say, it's weird. These people actually care for each other. They actually would die for each other. And I can imagine some of them talking like, do you know of any priest of Jupiter that would do that? What kind of people are these? What are the works here? Just a little side point here. What are the works? What are the good works that we are to be doing in order to have people glorify God? Now, some have suggested it was mainly evangelism that Jesus is talking about. I don't think that really fits the context, although I believe that's included in this. I think, as one writer said, the works here is the most broadest sense of good works. It's, as he said, it covers everything a Christian says and does because he is a Christian. Every outward and visible manifestation of his Christian faith. Simply, it's living as Christ lived. As one of my favorite quotes that is to kind of illustrate this. Your life as a Christian should make non-Christians question their disbelief in God. I think that's really what Jesus is getting at. Your life as a disciple should get those who do not believe to question their disbelief. What am I doing wrong? Why are these people different? Why are they doing these things? And I don't see this happening in the world. It has a natural pulling effect. Light is to be seen, not hidden. And light illuminates. Light illuminates. It shows them the better way. It shows the world the better way, that it does not have to be this dog-eat-dog vicious cycle that the world is so engaged in. That there can be meaning and joy and happiness and love and life here and now, and not simply the same old hatred-filled cycle. That there is a better way. So what do we learn from this small but densely packed section of the Sermon on the Mount? What do we learn here? I want to suggest 3 lessons here in the time we have left. And I appreciate your attention this morning. The first one is the same one that we've been emphasizing from the very beginning. That there is a fundamental difference between Christians and the world. There is a fundamental difference. And to the degree we diminish that, ignore that, or pretend that does not exist, is to the degree we will not be salty and our light will be hidden. We cannot hide that fact. We are separate and distinct people. And it's only when we recognize that we are not like the world, that we are other, if you will, we are separate and set apart, that we can finally serve the world. There's much problem with many Christians today, or many churches, is that they're trying to bring in people with the world's means. They'll try and win them in with gift baskets and giveaways, and I'm not making that up. I remember a Facebook ad I saw for a church up in Casa Grande for their Easter service. That's a separate discussion. They were giving away, were doing an airdrop from a helicopter of, I think, 5 brand new PlayStation 4s. And if you showed up, you had the chance to run out in the field and catch one. PlayStation 4 weighs about a good 8 pounds, but if you're dropping from a helicopter, I'm not good at physics, but at that velocity, I would not want to be on the receiving end of that PlayStation. But my first thought after I saw that ad was, what are they going to have to do next year? There's nothing wrong with, if you personally want to buy one. But if that's what's attracting people to the church, we're preaching a different gospel. As Martin Lloyd-Jones said, that it's only when the church fully recognizes and fully embodies its otherness that the world finally is attracted to its message. A message it will hate at first, because it's salt. It stings. But after it gets past the initial hatred, many will believe and obey it. None of us likes it when hydrogen peroxide or salt gets rubbed in a wound. But we know both of those things, that there's a healing effect going on. We know we have to go through that hydrogen peroxide dip if we want to make sure we don't get infected. And afterward comes a soothing ointment that is balm to our wounds. The second thing we learn here, as I've indicated, we must accept the responsibility of serving the world. If you are in the kingdom, you are a servant. There's no exemption card, there's no conscious objector card to service. We are called to serve. And the way we do that is by fulfilling Christ's vision for who we ought to be salt and light in this dark world. And our responsibility, this third lesson, is both positive and negative. Salt, by its nature, its effect, is rather negative. It's preventative. It disdains rot. It calls attention to rot. It kills the rot. Now consider the world that we live in. Let's turn to Romans chapter 1 for just a moment. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 18. Paul's description of the world in which he lived in is not too different than the world we live in. In fact, I would say it's almost exactly the same. We just have different toys. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 18. I will read through verse 24. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and from an unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made in like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves. And Paul continues on there. I could point out any number of examples of this. The futile in their speculations, God gave them up to the uncleanness and purity of their hearts. All that verse really means there is, God let them feel the full consequence of their actions. In fact, Psalm 81 and verse 12, if you want to jot a note down, that will help you explain that verse. That psalmist says God gave them up to their own counsels, that is, their own wisdom. He wasn't going to have any providential stopgaps in there. You want to go down that path? Fine. I'm not going to stop you. But that's the world we live in. And yet, as salt, we're called to speak truth into that world. That there is only one Savior. That marriage is sacred. That human sexuality is defined and clear from God's order of creation. that there is objective truth to be known, and there is hope for a future. Brother, I'll tell you right now, that message in particular resonates with people. You have some in our society right now that, due to their understandings of climate, and that's all I'm going to say on that, have estimated that we have 12 years left. Woo! That's a happy thought. Many of our young people have been brought up in a society where basically it's been doom and gloom, and we're always right on the cusp of the end of the world. There's no hope. The gospel brings hope to people, which goes to that second point. Light is largely positive. It illuminates. It illuminates. We begin with people where we're salt. It hurts. It does. Truth hurts when you haven't heard it before. But that's quickly followed by the light that shows the better way, the better path. Kind of wrapping up these ideas, one writer said, so Jesus calls his disciples to exert a double influence on the secular community. A negative influence by arresting its decay, and a positive influence by bringing light into darkness. For it's one thing to stop the spread of evil. It is another to promote the spread of truth, beauty, and goodness. We are called to do both. And Jesus is about ready, and we're not even done with the Sermon on the Mount yet. Now we've seen what a disciple is supposed to be like in their character and what their effect, their influence is supposed to be on the world. He's about ready to talk about now his relation with the Old Testament law. And he's going to give, in the really heart of chapter 5, what does it mean to be a disciple with integrity? That covers much of the teaching in Matthew chapter 5 there. But maybe you're here this morning and you have felt the sting of the salt of a disciple or of the word. Well, I want to give you light this morning. Jesus came into this world. The reason why he began teaching the sermon is the beginning of his ministry, to show people there is a better way. That the way of truth and life was revealed to men. That he had come to save sinners. And he did so, as we talked about the Lord's table this morning, by giving himself up willingly as a sin offering, so that all who would choose to partake in his sacrifice would be saved. And Jesus made it very simple for us. At the end of Mark's gospel, Mark records the words of our Lord, the one who believes in me and is baptized shall be saved. The one who does not believe shall be condemned. Maybe you're at that point here this morning, you're ready to commit yourself to Christ. We can help you to do that in the waters of baptism for the remission of your sins. Maybe you have questions, or maybe you're struggling spiritually. If you have need of prayers, confession, or of baptism, please, once you come forward, every stand and sing the song that's been selected.